You're listening to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981.
And now, here's your host.
Welcome back to the program. I'm Zev Brenner. Always a privilege. I always enjoy having David Schoen. He's an American attorney. He specializes in federal crimes, federal criminal defense, I should say, and civil rights law. He's one of the attorneys who represented former President Donald Trump during his second impeachment hearings. He has represented Jeffrey Epstein. He's doing Julia Hart. He's in the middle of representing Steve Bannon, who was just given a 4-month sentence in jail just the other day. So, David, good to have you back. Always enjoy having you. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Same here.
So I guess the most current in the news is Steve Bannon. Did you expect that he would be getting a prison sentence of 4 months? Was that what you were expecting?
Yeah, pretty close to what I expected. The government was asking for 6 months. Originally, they were saying they're going to get 2 years, but then they came down to 6 months. They were asking for a $200,000 fine. So he got 4 months and a $6,500 fine. So we saved him a little money at least. But I don't believe he'll ever have to serve any time or pay any fine. The case is on appeal. The most, I think, significant event of the day was the judge granting bail pending appeal. The government argued vigorously against giving bail pending appeal. And the DC Circuit happens to have a very high standard. You have to prove first that he's not a flight risk or danger to the community. That was easy. But also that there's a substantial question that likely to result in reversal or some high standard like that. And the judge found immediately that he satisfies the standard, and the judge listed off 4 issues at least that he believes are very serious issues for appeal. He said during the trial about 6 times that he thinks that the standard definition of willfully that he applied in the case that prohibited Bannon from putting any evidence before the jury as to why he didn't comply with the subpoena. The judge said he does not think that that standard complies with either modern law on willfully or traditional law, but that his hands were bound by a 1961 case from the DC Circuit. So that's a primary issue for appeal.
But is that correct? Because from what I've read, it's very unusual that you'll find a jail sentence for contempt of Congress.
Yeah, well, I said to the judge, they applied the Bannon rule here. There is the statute itself purports to have a mandatory minimum of 1 month on each count. In every other case in the DC, in this same district, by this same U.S. Attorney's Office, they argued to the court that there is no mandatory minimum. In Bannon's case, they argued, there's absolutely a mandatory minimum, and the language is clear. So I presented the judge with 4 arguments that they made in each of the other cases as to why it's so clear that there is no mandatory minimum. And I thought that they should be stopped from raising any other argument. They said, oh, no, Judge, the law has changed since then. There's no change in the law. The statute's been the same since the 30s.
So you think the judge's hands were bound? He really didn't want a sentence ban? Is that the impression you have from the judge?
I think he felt his hands were bound on the conviction itself. In other words, here's what happened. Bannon gets a subpoena from Congress, which itself is a bit of a complicated picture, not an everyday situation. And then he's told that executive privilege has been invoked. He hires an experienced lawyer. That lawyer says to him, Bannon, it's not just that you have a choice here. You have no choice. You may not comply with this subpoena. You have to honor executive privilege. But Bannon went a step further, and he said, committee, through his lawyer, committee, my hands are tied. I can't honor the subpoena because executive privilege has been invoked. When executive privilege is invoked, it's presumptively valid. It's not for Congress to say it's not valid. That'd be a separation of powers issue. But he said, if you present this to a judge in a civil enforcement proceeding, like they do in most cases, and the judge says either executive privilege doesn't apply or it doesn't apply this extensively, or I still have to produce something, I will comply with whatever that judge says. And that's the way our constitutional system works. The courts have said only the court can be the arbiter. The committee had no interest in that because they never wanted Bannon's testimony. They wanted to try to send a message through Bannon and make an example of him. And they were clear in their public statements that that's what they wanted. So anyway, so the question is, did Bannon act willfully when he didn't comply with the subpoena? The Supreme Court, DC Circuit, the last 35 years have said clearly that willfully means believing or knowing that your conduct is wrongful or unlawful or criminal in some manner. In this case, it's the opposite. Bannon understood from his lawyer that his conduct was the only lawful course he could take. So I said to the judge, there is, many commentators have said, we don't impose criminal liability in our system, and we certainly don't send people to prison if they didn't believe or understand that their conduct was illegal or unlawful or wrongful. And that's the case here. So when we started out the sentencing, I said to the judge, I'm in the unusual position here of having a client at sentencing who I can't say is remorseful. I can't say has to be punished or deterred. In fact, he should be encouraged. He took a step that was consistent with the rule of law and with our Constitution and with respect for the institution of the presidency and executive privilege. We don't want people, lay people on their own to decide, well, I think executive privilege applies here, it doesn't apply here. That's for a court to decide, and that's what he asked. They had no interest in it. I'll tell you one further thing on this. The government argued to the jury two things that were improper, at least. The judge said Bannon cannot put on any evidence before the jury as to why he didn't comply with the subpoena. So the government argued to the jury, Bannon didn't comply with the subpoena because he thought he was above the law. He just ignored the subpoena. That wasn't true, and it's not fair to allow the government to concoct a reason when Bannon can say his reason. Secondly, they said to the jury that Bannon ignoring the subpoena, he didn't ignore it, is like telling a referee, you've got it wrong, I know better. Congressional committee can never be a referee of its own authority or its own subpoena. And so I quoted to the judge from Madison in Federalist 47 and 48, in which he makes that point exactly, quoting from Montesquieu, that if you allow a legislative body to become the judge of its own authority, we have tyranny.
So I don't understand, if he's claiming, and he claimed executive privilege, shouldn't that claim be authenticated or dismissed before any other charges can be brought? How can they bring charges while this is still hanging in the air? Explain.
Right. So they decided, the committee decided unilaterally that executive privilege doesn't apply, or that even with executive privilege, he should have produced some records and all of that. What message are we sending? Telling a layperson, ignore your lawyer's advice? You decide how to comply with executive privilege? That's not a message we can afford to send. That would completely violate separation of powers and make executive privilege a nullity, not something we have to respect. And it is something we have to respect. So that's why Bannon said, let's go to a judge. Let the judge decide first if executive privilege applies, and if so, what my obligations are. And so this judge, Judge Nichols, in Bannon's case at sentencing, said one of the reasons he's granting bail pending appeal is because the Court of Appeals needs to look at this and see what are the obligations of the recipient of a subpoena when executive privilege is invoked. I'll tell you another very interesting issue the judge identified as being a substantial question for appeal. Bannon was charged because he didn't comply with the subpoena, didn't show up. So I subpoenaed all of the members of the committee. We had a number of questions we wanted to ask them, and I made a very detailed proffer to the court as to why we needed them as witnesses here. A defendant has a constitutional right to compel testimony at a trial. All of the members of the committee and all of their staffers claimed a speech and debate clause privilege, and they didn't have to show up. And the judge granted that motion. So I said, first of all, look at the irony. Bannon gets charged criminally for not showing up. We ask them to show up to explain their actions, why they referred him criminally, why they wouldn't let him go before a judge to rule on the privilege issue. And they refused to show up based on their privilege. So I said to the judge, you may be right about letting them not testify, but if you're right, then the case should be dismissed because Bannon has the right to call them to testify and the criminal case ought to take priority. So the judge said now he thinks that's an issue the Court of Appeals has to look at.
Now, on what basis did they say they do not have to testify? What is that clause?
The Constitution provides that they have immunity if they say or do something in the course of what they call speech and debate. Now here we said, but their conduct went beyond speech and debate as legislators. They gave public statements mocking Bannon, saying what they wanted to do to Bannon, what message they wanted to send. We said, how about those things? The judge found it was all included in their privilege, and therefore they don't have to answer. I said, Judge, think of the message that's sending. They're not answerable to the American people. They're not answerable in a court of law for their actions in this case. They should have to explain why they dragged a citizen before a court under criminal charges.
Are they trying to, and it seems like during this whole course of the year or so, they're trying to expand congressional powers to where it doesn't really exist?
Yeah, I mean, certainly now, but unfortunately for them, I think, if the Congress turns, there's going to be sort of hell to pay, I'm afraid. This is going to be just a cycle going on. And so another party comes in, they're going to say, well, look, this is what you folks did. Listen, this committee, from my point of view, is illegitimate from the start. And another issue the judge said has to go before the Court of Appeals is the composition of this committee. First of all, they violated the rules in its composition. They took unprecedented steps also, which I thought was a mistake politically. But beyond all that, the conflicts of interest are extraordinary. You have Chairman Thompson, who Pelosi appointed to chair the committee, who just before he became chair, sued President Trump, saying that President Trump was personally liable and responsible for the events of January 6th, and that he, Chairman Thompson, was personally injured by Trump's actions. How can that person be the head of a committee that's supposed to investigate what happened in the events of January 6th? Similarly, Raskin and Schiff have written books about the events of January 6th, blaming President Trump. They have a vested interest in proving that the conclusions in their book is what the committee comes out with. So this is completely illegitimate and shouldn't be accepted by the American people.
So who's watching them? Who's monitoring to make sure that they comply with the rule of law?
Nobody, because right now there are no checks and balances in the system. You have one party in control of, the Congress and the presidency. So there's nobody really monitoring. The executive branch certainly isn't. They're working hand in hand with the committee. So no, it's a very scary situation. And anybody who sees what happened in the Bannon case ought to really feel a chilling effect from this thing. And it probably ought to be a strong motivation to vote and not have folks in office who are going to abuse this kind of power like this. Look, you can be sure this idea now of subpoenaing President Trump is for show. I mean, what is it that they need to know further in this so-called investigation here? They know everything that happened. Everybody knows everything that happened now. It's just a show. It's unfortunately making a mockery of an important process, what should be an important investigation, but they're doing it right on the verge of the midterms because that's a matter of policy for them. This January 6th committee seems to be a matter of policy.
David Schoen is our guest, a prominent attorney specializing in criminal defense as well as civil rights. And he has a lot of interesting clients, including former President Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein and Julia Hart. And now he's defending Steve Bannon. Let me ask you a question. Why didn't Steve Bannon just testify before Congress and plead the fifth and not say anything?
A lot of people ask that question. So the real answer is Steve Bannon just won't do that. That's not Steve Bannon. My answer is, had he come to me, and he wouldn't have listened to me, I think, but I would advise any client who goes before this committee, because I believe it's illegitimate, to take the fifth. I believe they have an agenda simply to go after people who they perceive to be political enemies and powerful people politically who cut into their realm, let's say. Steve Bannon is a very powerful, persuasive person with a tremendous following of millions of people, and he has an impact on elections. They don't want that to happen. They want to try to stymie people like that. Listen, Jerry Nadler said it himself a couple of years ago. He said they can't trust the American voters to deal with Trump. And so they have to do all of these extraordinary mechanisms that really pervert the system, in my opinion.
No, I agree with you. Now, is it a coincidence that after Steve Bannon was found and sentenced to 4 months in prison, that a subpoena appeared for Donald Trump? Were they waiting for the verdict of the court to say, aha, now we can get Donald Trump and maybe hold him in contempt, maybe try to put him in prison?
Yeah, I imagine they were waiting for the sentence to come out, but I don't know. Do they really think they won this thing with a 4-month sentence and a $6,500 fine after they assigned 3 federal prosecutors and 4 FBI agents to the case? They had an alternative. They look foolish before the American people if people are really interested in an investigation. And you have a federal judge who has said you should have bail pending appeal because there are substantial questions about the validity of this conviction.
And you're confident that he's going to be vindicated by the appeals court?
I certainly am confident of it, and more than that, I certainly hope so. And I think every American should hope so. We don't send people to prison or find criminal liability in this country where a person acts as he believed the rule of law provided and as his experienced attorney told him he must comply.
No, absolutely. Just frightening, because whether you're right or left, Republican or Democrat, the rule of law has to be applied to all sides at all times. It may not be popular, but the law has to be neutral, and the law is not neutral. That's the problem, I think. That you see that all the time. You're with the American Civil Liberties Union. They won't take on unpopular cases anymore, right? Like they used.
In my day, 20 years ago, when I represented them in all of their litigation in Alabama, they were all unpopular cases, let's say. but they were out front leading it. I see the former head of it, who was head of it at the time, Nadine Strassen, has spoken out against their philosophy now, that they don't take those kinds of cases anymore. They only take, cases that are approved by cancel culture.
Now, are you afraid to take cases because you've had the repercussions for representing Donald Trump in the second impeachment hearing? Steve Bannon is not a very popular figure. Have people attacked you or shunned you or try to run you out for certain cases for representing these people?
The answer to that last question is certainly yes, but it doesn't make me not take the cases. If it did, then I think I shouldn't be practicing law, quite frankly. And this is Alan Dershowitz has suggested to me that we sort of go on the road and tell the story of what's happened with me in these cases, especially to law students, but about the importance of taking on unpopular causes. When I take on unpopular causes on the other side of the spectrum, people laud it and it's God's work and all of that, and it has to be done. But when it comes to representing these figures, people see things differently. And I don't think that's the way to approach the law. But yeah, I mean, I said as soon as I walked out of the courtroom in the Bannon case, I knew the emails would come. And most of the ones I've gotten since then, by the way, Bannon is super popular in many circles. He's got millions and millions of followers. Same President Trump, had 75 million voters. But there are these people who, have nothing to do apparently, but issue threats. So I get a number of death threats and all that. But since the Bannon sentencing, most of the negative emails I've gotten have been from folks who say they're Jewish and say what an embarrassment it is to have an observant Jew like me representing Steve Bannon and so on. Although some of them preface their email by saying, we recognize everyone has the right to an attorney, just didn't have the right to you, and all of that sort of thing. I'm very disappointed to see Jews taking that position. That's not my experience with Jewish thought, at least. I've always found, other Jews to generally, certainly Jewish intellectuals, to be understand the idea that everyone has the right to an attorney, and that an attorney serves to see that the law is upheld and that sort of thing. And we have an adversarial system. But they're going to say what they want. I don't understand the folks who just send emails cursing at me and all that. That's not particularly productive, it seems to me, or it certainly wouldn't engender any discussion. When I've gotten thoughtful ones, sometimes I'll respond. I say, here's my thinking. What do you think? And generally they appreciate it.
No, listen, you're taking a firm position and you're sticking to your beliefs because you believe whether you like the client or not, the client is entitled to representation. That's what's American Civil Liberties Union. I didn't particularly like them over the course of time when they represented Nazis in Skokie, but you know what? I appreciate it now when they won't take on unpopular causes.
Yeah, I'll tell you an irony. I mean, as I've said, I represent right now on a pro bono basis a man in Alabama who was convicted of killing a woman and her 2 children for no reason. He was on drugs. He was a friend of the family. Bizarre crime, horrific crime. People say to me, oh, you're doing God's work in the South and, with Brian Stevenson and all of this business. But when it comes to representing a former president of the United States, that's, horrible, beyond the pale. And, I shouldn't be a lawyer.
Crazy. Were you representing Donald Trump, President Trump, in his indictment now in the court? They want for his, or excuse me, he's has a subpoena to appear before Congress. Obviously, he's not going to show up. Are you going to represent him in that battle as well?
I don't think so. I'm representing Bannon now. My plate's pretty full, and he has a group of lawyers. There's been some criticism about all of this.
But he likes the work. He likes the work you do, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, I had a great relationship with him, but he has, unfortunately, at times, certain intermediaries that insinuate themselves into the situation and, want everything to do with him and want to be advising him, want to have lawyers involved to this person can control and all of that. And I don't really want to be involved with that sort of thing. When I deal directly with President Trump, I have a terrific relationship with him. And, he seems to have great confidence in me. I hope, like I hope with every client, but right now I'm not involved. Originally I was asked to go through those documents at Mar-a-Lago back in, I don't know, May or June, and I declined. I felt that wasn't the kind of thing. It's not the kind of thing I do really. I'm brought in to handle cases in court, not really sift through documents and all that, and that's become a mess into itself.
Now, it doesn't Bannon also have a problem with other indictments where they're looking to say that he's pilfered money? Is that all part of the problem? Are you representing him in those cases too?
Yes, it's one case in the state of New York he was brought originally In a federal case, he got a pardon during the course of it. But yeah, so that case is just getting underway now. It's in New York Supreme Court in Manhattan. From what my investigation so far, there's absolutely no basis to the allegations. But it's a very political prosecution. The person behind it is this, Miss Letitia James, the Attorney General in New York, who ran on a platform of going after Trump and all aligned with Trump and all of that. It's a shame and a shock to me the way the courts are being used, their criminal justice system being weaponized now for partisan political purposes. It's a terrible thing that we should never allow in this country.
But who's going to stop him? That's the question, because I asked you that before. If nobody stops them, then the ante is up and it keeps getting worse and worse unless there's some checks and balances here.
Right. And we need some courageous judges. They bring them in jurisdictions in which they think they'll get a friendly jury, Washington, D.C., New York, and so on. And there is a lot of rhetoric against the right wing, against Bannon, against Trump in those places. So they are most likely to get a friendly jury. But we don't pervert the rule of law simply because we think we can get a jury that will agree to anything the government says, as long as it's anti-Trump or anti-Bannon. That's a terrible perversion of the system.
David Schoen is our guest. He's an attorney specializing in criminal defense. He's also a civil rights attorney, and he has some great clients, including former President Donald Trump, who represented him in the second impeachment hearings. He's currently representing Steve Bannon. He did Jeffrey Epstein, and also he's doing Julia Hart, among a whole slew of very interesting clients. Now, before, David, you mentioned that, you've been getting correspondence and emails from Jews who were upset that you were an observant Jew and representing Steve Bannon. And we know there is a divide in the Jewish community, with the more Orthodox nationalist Jewish community supporting Donald Trump even now, and the more liberal Jews oppose him every step of the way. In fact, President Donald Trump has been labeled anti-Semite recently for saying he can't understand why Jews didn't support him when he was great on Israel, and whether it was moving the embassy or with the Iran deal, etc., where he got rid of it. So how do you perceive it? Because he's saying what he believes, that he's surprised that Jews don't vote for him. Yet he's been labeled an anti-Semite. You've been close with him. You've been speaking to him, obviously, in his defense. So how do you view this whole thing where they're trying to label an anti-Semite again?
I think they're terribly, terribly wrong. I think it's an unfair label. There's real anti-Semitism out there. And I think we undercut our own mission when we label people anti-Semites, who certainly are not. Donald Trump's family, everybody knows about the Jewish connection. But as I have said, he's been as gracious as can be to me, totally respected my Sabbath observance at all times. Had Jason Greenblatt, he gave that as an example to me when I told him I'm not going to be able to participate on Saturday and Friday night. He said, oh, Jason Greenblatt would have to leave a closing sometimes early and that sort of thing. Right now, to me, one of the more offensive things, they've taken a statement that he made completely out of context. Even the ADL is blasted Trump for it. It's not at all what he said. He said something to the effect that American Jews need to wake up. Christian evangelicals have been much greater supporters of his. He's been a great friend to Israel. American Jews need to wake up before it's too late. People said, well, that must be some kind of threat to American Jews. No, he's expressing his view, many people would believe is accurate, that American Jews don't recognize the existential threat that many countries in the Arab world and the PLO and the PA pose for Israel, and they need to wake up before it's too late for Israel. That Israel faces an existential threat, and when are these folks, American Jews, going to wake up and see that and take appropriate action and appreciate things like the Abraham Accords, making the capital Jerusalem, Jerusalem passport issue, those kinds of things. I think he's right.
No, listen, he's aware of the fact that the majority of Jews didn't vote for him. And it's only, what it was, about 30%, I believe, that somewhere around that number that voted for him. So he may have done better with some other Republican candidates, but he didn't do as well as he thought he should have done, based on the fact that he was very, very supportive of Israel. You can't take that away from him.
Right. And they're certainly entitled to vote however they like to vote, and entitled to make Israel an issue or not an issue. But his statement stands that American Jews ought to stand by Israel. They don't seem to appreciate, by and large, the majority of American Jews don't seem to appreciate the existential nature of the threat Israel faces, and the reason it's so important to take steps to address those threats, as President Trump took when he was in office. Unprecedented steps, finally called terrorists, as I say, Jerusalem capital, Abraham Accords, and on and on and on.
Absolutely.
Golan, recognition of the Golan.
And the Iran deal also was a big
Iran deal, of course.
very big deal because during the time he was in office, they were sponsoring terrorism, and not like what they're doing today, where they're even supplying Russia with drones. I know you also wear a hat. You're a very committed Jew. You're observant. I like the fact that you're not afraid to wear a yarmulke in public when you're in court, and you're also a member on the board of the Zionist Organization of America. I believe the president's going to be one of the events coming up soon, right?
Yeah, there's a special award going to President Trump actually for his service in support of the state of Israel. Really unprecedented support. And ZOA decided that he deserved that award. So yeah, I'm actually emceeing the dinner November 13th.
No, absolutely. Listen, I think he deserves the credit. We live in an age where I don't know why we can't say, you know what, I don't like your rest of your policies, but I want to say thank you for what you did. I speak to Jews that say they can't stand Trump and they won't acknowledge what he did with the Abraham Accords or with Jerusalem or with Iran. It's like, I just don't understand the logic. You can say, listen, I don't like his policies at X, Y, Z, but this he did well, and they're afraid to say so. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. You can say anything. You can say, I don't like the language he uses. I don't like his approach to things. It's too bombastic, or so on. At least appreciate what he's done or tried to do for the state of Israel. It really is unprecedented.
I know it's a crazy thing, but so far you've doing Steve Bannon. You also have another interesting case, Julia Hart, the star of Netflix TV, who was Orthodox, is not Orthodox today, and she's involved in a whole major divorce case, right, with her non-Jewish husband, and where she also has been living her life on Netflix. Which are you going to be part of the Netflix second series when she's getting profiled?
No, I don't think they want to break the camera with my face.
I think it'll enhance, it may add something to the production, but how is that going?
I think she's going full speed ahead with Netflix. I don't do divorce work, but I sort of entered an appearance in various cases she has. Hired local counsel, very good lawyer, Sheldon Eisenberger, and she has Delaware counsel, Brian Ralston, terrific lawyers. She's got a number of issues going on. There's control of this, very successful company, a company that she made very successful as CEO. Whatever anyone thinks about her approach to Judaism and so on, she's a very talented and very bright person. And by all accounts, she did a fabulous job as the CEO of, a company which she made one of the largest talent agencies in the world, largest modeling agency in the world. So she's in a bitter battle with her soon-to-be ex-husband in the divorce case, but also she's brought a fraud action against him, a defamation action. There's an action over how much of the company he had promised her in a number of representations, emails, filings with the government, and so on, that she owns half of that company. And now he's saying otherwise. And a court in Delaware found that based on the corporate documents, she doesn't own half of the company, but she may own 49.99%. He tricked her and held back a share at some point, but we'll see. It's a very involved, very complicated litigation that promises to go on for quite a while, unfortunately.
So here's my question, David. I know you for a while now. How do you find time to do everything? You have these high profile cases, you have pro bono cases, you're also active in the Jewish community. Where do you find time for all of it?
Yeah, there's not enough time really. And I don't think practicing as a solo practitioner is the way to go, quite frankly. And so I try to associate lawyers in these cases. In the new Bannon case, I associated great lawyer in New York, John Mitchell. And, but ultimately I'm responsible to the client. The client's hiring me for a purpose. Julia Hart says in every proceeding she's in, she wants me to do the talking and so on. And I say to her, many of these fields I don't have any expertise in really, and you wouldn't be well served to have me do the talking. So I just talk a lot, but not necessarily of any quality.
No, I'm sure listen, you have a lot of successful cases, a very successful career. The irony is when in the Steve Bannon case, and especially in the President Donald J. Trump case, when you were his lawyer in the second impeachment hearings, I think a lot of the Orthodox Jewish community liked what you did. In the Julia Hart case, it's probably just the opposite. They don't know what you're saying. You're not getting involved in her religious state of affairs. You're looking strictly based on law. Is she entitled to whatever percentage, 50% of the business that she and her soon-to-be ex-husband put together?
Right. I take on cases because of my attraction to the legal issues generally, but I also like to like my clients. If I didn't like my clients and they didn't like me, I don't think it would work well. and it sounds crazy, but I had a great relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. People think he's a monster. I didn't find that to be the case at all. Donald Trump's been nothing but gracious to me. People talk about, his bombastic side. That's not, what I get. But in any event, I'm interested in the issues, but I'm also interested in maintaining my own, sort of standards, ethics, and sense of autonomy in all of these cases. So all of my clients know that while they have had other lawyers who accede to certain demands, I won't, and I don't. And, in the Trump impeachment case, it was a very high pressured situation. And it's one point during it, early on, when the trial started, I was directed by a number of people to tell the other lawyers that they would not be permitted to speak any further and that I had to handle the entire thing. Had that been the case from the start, I would have been happy to handle the entire thing with backup support for briefing and all of that. But I wasn't going to tell other lawyers that they couldn't talk. And I didn't think that's my place. I think it's the client's place if that's the view of a client. But, a number of things. I think, there is a danger for all of these clients if they have only yes people around them. It's a dangerous situation. And no client should want that, frankly.
No, absolutely. And certainly you're a team player, but sometimes the team doesn't want to play with you, right? They have their own way of doing it. You mentioned that in our last interview with President Trump, and where he had intervened and we told you to take charge, but they want to take charge. So you have some of that too.
Yeah.
In the few moments that we have remaining, I was just curious. I got some feedback after our last interview. You mentioned about Jeffrey Epstein. And you mentioned that you believe that he didn't commit suicide. So people were wondering so who do you think did it? And will justice be served out in this case? Because the way the case is left right now is that he committed suicide.
Yeah, I don't think justice will be served. Former Attorney General Barr has written a book, and in his book, he says unequivocally it was suicide. He certainly can't know that because probably the top forensic pathologist in the world, Michael Bannon, doesn't believe it was suicide. And I'm going to put Bannon up against Barr any day in terms of determining a cause of death. But I don't have a theory as to who did it. Ordinarily, if someone were in prison were to kill an alleged sex offender, that person often takes credit for it. That never happened here, but that may be because it's so high profile. They tried to make the guards the scapegoats at some point for not properly monitoring the situation. Jeffrey Epstein was attacked earlier in his cell. They tried to call that an attempted suicide. He explained to me exactly what happened in that situation. It wasn't an attempted suicide, but I don't think they have any real interest in getting to the bottom of it because nobody looks good in that situation. I know that his brother would very much like to find out what happened, but I don't think anyone ever will. I've said I don't believe it was suicide based on the anecdotal information I have. That is, I met with him 9 days before he died. And he was very active. We agreed on going forward in the case, had attorney-client agreement. We had a plan of action to fight the case. And I was told by people present that the day before he died, he was still barking out orders based on our strategy in the case. And then, Michael Bannon participated in the forensic examination shortly after the death. And he said at the time, the city's medical examiner couldn't conclude that it was suicide. All of a sudden, 4 days later, she changed her mind, said it was suicide. He said there's no additional information. But in all of the thousands of autopsies he's performed, he never saw injuries like Jeffrey Epstein had that were consistent with suicide. That speaks volumes to me.
So it's not like a prisoner decided to eliminate him. It sounds like it was orchestrated by higher up than that.
I don't know. I don't believe in conspiracy theories generally, so I really don't know.
Just laid out the case for it.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, at least for a cover-up now. But I think I tend to believe that just another prisoner killed him, but I really don't know.
No, it's certainly the book. Now, does his brother have any legal recourse to try to open up an investigation? Does he have any legal standing in that basis?
I don't think so. One would think he would, but based on the estate papers, other people were appointed to be, managing executors of the estate and that sort of thing. So the brother really doesn't have any independent standing, but he very much wants there to be a full investigation. That I can tell you. And he loved his brother.
But if he's not the executor of the estate, but being a brother, doesn't he have some legal rights nevertheless?
Not to require an investigation of the case, not to determine what happens with the body and any of those kinds of things, not to any distribution of assets. He may have a beneficiary interest in the estate, but one would have to know the estate papers for that. immediately after he died, his in-house counsel had asked me if I would take over all litigation and including the estate stuff. And I had already lined up people who were estate specialists and forfeiture specialists and all of that. But that relationship didn't last. Some of the, he had some very prominent lawyers representing him. And I think they didn't want me involved in the case, frankly. And in fact, one of them said afterwards that it wasn't true that Epstein wanted to hire me in the case. I mean, that's just silly. He paid me a fee, in the case. But anyway, his in-house counsel said that I was the only lawyer he trusted at the end of the day. And what these other lawyers didn't know was that he was having me review their work while he was representing them. But, Alan Dershowitz knew that what Epstein wanted and that sort of thing at the time, I'm sure. In fact, the one time I visited Epstein in his home, Professor Dershowitz called up. And anyway, so to me, it's a tragic story all around. And if the so-called victims believe they wanted their day in court, then it's a tragedy for them too that they didn't get their day in court.
David, when you're writing your book?
No, I don't think
you probably going to be a bestseller. You've interviewed so many interesting. We only scratched the surface on our broadcast now, but you've had many interesting people, many great interactions.
My civil rights cases are the best of all, I think, and they're the ones I'm the most proud of, quite frankly.
Right. Well, you mentioned as we're closing, I believe there was one person who was it a neo-Nazi or a KKK individual that wanted you and tell us that story because I love that story.
It was from the ACLU, actually. The ACLU approached me and asked me if I would represent the leader, the Mississippi Ku Klux Klan group. It was a guy named Jordan Golub, and so they said, nobody wanted to represent the guy. It's the Klan. He and his group wanted to march on what they called White Heritage Day in a rural county in Alabama that was predominantly African American but run by whites. And so at first the town had said, no, you can't march here. Then they set up a high financial price to do it for security costs, and they passed an ordinance that they couldn't wear their masks in the march. So the ACLU hired me to take on the case. I said, get this guy on the phone first. I don't want to put in hundreds of hours pro bono, and here I don't want a Jew lawyer. So I knew his name was Jordan Golub. So I went to the Southern Poverty Law Center, Klan Watch, and I said, give me the book on Jordan Golub. They said, well, in fact, he was Jewish, but he abandoned it and became Christian Science. So when they got him on the phone with me, the ACLU set it up. I said, Mr. Golub, I got to tell you, your name sounds kind of Jewish to me. He got very angry and all that, So we moved on. And I said, well, I just want you to know that I'm Jewish, so is that going to be a problem? He said, oh, my God, well, I wish you were white and Christian, but it's better than being a Zionist Jew. So I said, well, let me give you the rest of the bad news, Mr. Golub. But anyway, we went forward and I won the case. They did a caricature of me in the paper, hanging my head, saying I won the case. It's very emotional. People who'd been victimized by the Klan were in court. They were crying. I was crying. The judge seemed to enjoy the whole situation, I'm afraid. And I do think it was an important, First Amendment right that I helped to uphold in that case. But I took a lot of flack for that case. But when I say, my civil rights case is the most important to me, and I represented all of the emotionally disturbed children in Alabama, struck down the constitutionality of the foster care system, all of the school children in Alabama. Unfortunately, I filed a complaint, but unfortunately, I didn't get to play a role in the trial because I had another trial. But, prisons, jails, and I'm most honored. I won the American Bar Association Award, National Pro Bono Publico Service, saying that I did more to change the face of institutions in the South than any other lawyer of this era. That's the kind of stuff I became a lawyer to
No,
do.
you really, I admire the work that you do. My final question to you is, if the Republicans take over the House and they indict Joe Biden, will you represent him in his impeachment hearings?
If he wanted me to, I absolutely would. Be honored to.
I thought you'd say yes. But is there any case that you wouldn't take? Because you took a Nazi or a Ku Klux Klan.
Ku Klux Klan. Yeah, I wouldn't take an Arab terrorist, frankly, because I've represented a number of victims of Arab terrorism. And I wouldn't be able to competently serve them, I think. I don't take anymore. I don't take child abuse cases. It's too emotional for me. I'm not the best lawyer for it. Otherwise, I think generally, it'd be hard pressed to find a case I wouldn't take if I believed there were important issues in the case and a reason to take the case.
David Schoen, who is an attorney specializing in criminal defense. He's most proud of his civil rights. He's accomplished quite a bit in civil rights, and he has an impressive list of clients, including former President Donald Trump, who he represented in the second impeachment trial, Jeffrey Epstein, now Julia Hart, and Steve Bannon. Of course, he's still in the middle of representing him in 2 different trials. So we appreciate your being here with us. Look forward to having you back, and keep on doing the good work. And I know you're proud to be a Jew, you're proud to be a Zionist, and you really represent what lawyers should be about, even if you don't like the case. If you feel it represents a legal challenge, it needs to be represented, you're there. And we need to see more of that. As much as I said, I had problems with the ACLU on a philosophical basis, I miss the fact that they don't represent people that they don't like anyway. I think that's not the way it should be.
I'm proud to be your friend. I'm proud to be on your show. So thank you very much.
Likewise, and God should give you continuous strength to do so much more. You're a real pride of our community, and may you continue from strength to strength.
I mean, you too. Thank you very much.
Thank you for tuning in to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast, the pulse beat of the Jewish community.
For continuous Jewish programs, TalklineNetwork.com, or our 24-hour-a-day listen line at 641-741-0389. For past shows, you can find us on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, YouTube, Instagram, and all major podcast platforms, or jewishpodcast.org. Thanks for listening to the TalklineNetwork.com.